All right. Good morning from Ramsgate. My name is Catriona and I've been involved with Pugin and with the Pugin Society and with St. Augustine's Church for quite a long time. And my talk today is called Some Thoughts on the Painting of Our Lady and the Holy Child with St. Augustine of England and St. Thomas of Canterbury in the church here. The painting that you will be able to see now hanging on the south wall of St. Augustine and Pugin Visitor Centre at Ramsgate was the work of Ferdinand Platner, an artist based in Rome, and it was painted in 1854. I've chosen to talk about it out of all the many wonders of St. Augustine's Church, because I think that it makes an interesting and perhaps unexpected link to Pugin, although it is not his work and was not positioned in the church until after his death. It is signed by Platner in the bottom left-hand corner of the main painting, and then again in each of the two grisaille or monochrome panels below. This huge painting, oil on canvas and measuring in its frame 2,900 millimeters in height, or, if you are nostalgic for feet and inches, approximately 9.5 feet high, was restored to sensational effect in 2017. Before the restoration, this painting hung over the door in the south aisle of the church. The varnish had blackened, and the surface of the painting lay under an accumulation of dust and dirt gathered over a very considerable length of time. Very little of the subject matter was discernible, so the restoration was a revelation. While the conservation of the painting was under discussion, 3 letters were discovered at the Southwark Diocesan Archives which relate to it, thanks to John Coverdale, the previous shrine manager. The first 2 letters are from a novice of the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. Unfortunately, a man whose name is not easily deciphered, so we don't know who he is. The first letter to Bishop Grant of Southwark, dated November the 15th, 1857, is as follows. My dear Lord, your Lordship is, I believe, aware that some years ago I ordered a picture to be executed by Platner, which would represent 2 of our principal English saints, St. Augustine, the Apostle of England, and St. Thomas of Canterbury. This has now been finished for some time. Indeed, for 2 years, it has laid in a print gallery shop in Liverpool, awaiting my return from Rome. Since I ordered it, I have found that those 2 saints are the patron saints of the Diocese of Southwark. It strikes me, therefore, that I cannot do better than present it to some church in that diocese. And I should feel peculiarly grateful if your Lordship would kindly allow me to put it into your hands. The only conditions which I should wish to make as to its disposition being that it be set up in a public church in your diocese and over an altar dedicated to the 2 forenamed saints. If your Lordship will be good enough to let me know whether you would feel disposed to accept of such a conditional offer and where the picture should be sent, I should esteem it an additional favour, etc., etc. The next letter tells us much more about the painting. My dear Lord, I had the honour to receive your Lordship's letter this morning, for which I beg leave to thank you most sincerely, as also for your accepting the painting. As to the second condition, that is, being set up over an altar, I have no objection whatever to waive it, particularly as you propose putting the picture in a church dedicated to one of those saints. You will find that St. Augustine is at the right-hand side of our Blessed Lady, as the order I gave originated in a desire to do something in his honour. The painting of St. Thomas was an afterthought, as Platner thought it would be difficult to paint an incident of St. Augustine's life in a picture of such a shape as would be required for an altar. I mention this as if one saint should be preferred to the other, perhaps it would be more in accordance with the original intention that St. Augustine should be selected. Will you therefore oblige me by saying where and to whom you would wish me to have it forwarded? The third letter, still of 1857, is from the proposed recipient of the painting, Father, later Abbot, Wilfrid Alcock from St. Augustine's, Ramsgate. He writes, My Lord Bishop, I have received your very kind letter. I have not as yet seen anything of the painting. I don't know how we can well place it over our altar, there being a window there, as your Lordship is aware. If some other part of the church would do, we might perhaps manage. Do we detect a note of reluctance here on the part of Father Wilfrid? These three letters tell an intriguing tale. The person who commissioned this painting in Rome in 1854, only 2 years after Augustus Pugin's death, must have been a wealthy man to fund such a large and lavish work as this, and with such a fine frame. As one who had joined the Jesuits, he would have had to relinquish worldly goods, so either he commissioned the painting before becoming a Jesuit, or he had connections who were permitted by the Society to do so on his behalf. The fact that St. Thomas was only added as an afterthought, and partly to make the composition balance satisfactorily, meant that to explain the painting further, the grisaille, or monochrome panels at the base, were included to explain and justify the figures in accordance with the conventions of altarpiece painting. Below Augustine, who is on the left in the main painting, can be seen the encounter between him and King Ethelbert of Kent on the Isle of Thanet, and below Thomas, on the right, his murder in Canterbury Cathedral. Above are the Virgin and Child within a golden circular aureole and surrounded by cherubs' heads. In the background is a landscape in which a cross has been erected on a simple altar, in front of which some semi-clad folk, perhaps intended to be the first converts in East Kent, make obeisance. Stylistically, too, it is interesting that although the intention behind this painting was to emphasize and celebrate two archetypally English saints, the composition, luminous colour, and approach could not be more Italian, reminiscent not only of Raphael, but also of a more recent school, which we will come to shortly. On the face of it, one might not think this to be a painting that Pugin himself would have wanted in his church, not that it was intended for him. We might not necessarily have expected to see such a work in a Gothic church at all. However, there's an interesting link which perhaps to some extent gives a justification for its being here, beyond the obvious connection with St. Augustine. Pugin was a great admirer of the Nazarenes, a group of young and mainly German artists, many of whom were Catholic or became Catholic. These long-haired, archaically dressed artists have been given this name since the first Nazarenes were an early Christian group, deeply devout and given to plain living, as were the followers of Overbeck. This idealistic group was formed in reaction to contemporary painting in Germany and the official teaching of it there, as were the pre-Raphaelites in England somewhat later, and they espoused a revivalist religious medieval approach in their work, which was very sympathetic to Pugin. They decided in 1809 to leave Germany, and in 1810 they took over the disused monastery of St. Isidore in Rome, where they became well established and where they maintained an austere lifestyle. Although subsequently some of these artists returned to Germany, Overbeck remained in Rome, where Pugin actually met him in 1847, and where by then he had become a celebrated and venerable figure, visited by many admirers, including, for example, George Eliot. In the second edition of his Contrasts of 1841, Pugin referred to Overbeck as that prince of Christian painters, meaning that he was exemplary in looking back to early Renaissance art and its values and priorities, rather than to what Pugin thought of as the much more superficial art world of his own time. Well, who was Overbeck's assistant in 1850? Ferdinand Plattner. So we can claim him as having been trained in the Nazarene School. It is even possible that Pugin could have met him when he visited Overbeck. Plattner was born in 1824, and his father, who had settled in Rome, was a painter and writer on art. We don't know a great deal about this artist, but in 1856, when John Henry Newman was in Rome trying to organize the decoration and painting of the interior of the Catholic University Church in Dublin, the church of the new university there, of which Newman had been appointed rector in 1854, Plattner crops up again. Newman wrote to the convert writer and designer John Hungerford Pollen, who was in charge of the decoration of the university church, "I have arranged the following plan with your friend Mr. Plattner." Plattner, who was at that time living near the monastery of St. Isidore, then apparently recommended 2 young French artists to assist in the work. So here, even if a little tenuous, is a small connection with Pugin's and perhaps particularly Newman's world. A further connection if indirect, with Pugian can be made since the Nazarenes were particularly celebrated for their mural paintings and their knowledge of the necessary techniques of fresco to execute these, both in Rome and in Germany. When the Royal Fine Arts Commission was set up in 1841 to oversee a whole scheme of history painting in the new Houses of Parliament, Prince Albert, who headed the commission, was intent on introducing mural painting and the techniques of fresco to Westminster, since, as a German, he was familiar with and much admired the work of the Nazarenes. Artists selected to work at Westminster, such as the Scottish painter William Dyce, another artist whom Pugian favoured, probably because of his Nazarene connections and style, were required to understand the technique of fresco and to learn from the German artists as much as they could about it. Dyce had studied in Rome and knew Overbeck and to his followers, and this is reflected in the style of some of his own religious paintings, which were much admired by Albert and Victoria. In the event, the very complex matter of the history paintings at Westminster and their selected themes, and the fact that the techniques used turned out not to be appropriate to the climate and surfaces on which the paint was applied, led to many serious problems for the artists concerned and for their work. But that is another story. What is relevant to us here is that the first painting completed by William Dyce in the Lord's Chamber, directly above the monarch's Pugian-designed throne, was the 1846 Baptism of Ethelbert by St. Augustine. It must surely have been gratifying for Pugian, as it is for us, to consider that this subject, painted around the saint to whom Pugian had dedicated his church in Ramsgate, was deemed so significant to the history of England that it was given such a superlative position in the overall scheme. In conclusion, I have attempted from the starting point of Platner's painting here in Ramsgate to illustrate how one thing can lead to another, sometimes unexpectedly, and how interesting these links may be. They take one on invigorating journeys to surprising places. In looking at any artifact, one has to try to look not only at the physical object itself, but also to consider its wider context. And this can often be a rewarding experience. Goodbye, and thank you for listening.